Hello, everybody. Welcome to the LibertyCon 33. This is the panel titled Primordial Threats, a discussion of science fiction's tropes having to do with threats to humanity's survival coming from out there in the cosmos. I'm Mike Rothman. I'll be moderating today's panel. Many of the viewers on this panel may or may not be familiar with us. So we'll go through a round of introductions, and I guess I'll start with myself. I write under the moniker of M.A. Rothman. I have a pretty strong background in the sciences. I've been an engineer and researcher for more years than I care to count. I've written novels spanning the genres of hard science fiction, all variety of techno thrillers, and most recently I've dabbled in some lit RPG. I'm probably known for, putting real science into most of my stories. I sprinkle science into everything I write, kind of like some people sprinkle salt on their food. I'll note that the first book I released was Primordial Threat, and no, I had nothing to do with the choosing the name of this panel. But that's enough for me. Normally we'd be in person, I'd be able to point to people on the table, but let's go. Let's do this in alphabetical order. So by last name. So Arlan, why don't you kick off with an introduction?
Okay, I'm Arlan Andrews. I'm well known at all. It's for writing stories. I used to write fanlog over a period. I don't anymore. Some philosophical differences, but all out. Nothing to do with space, really. All of mine have to do with threats, wild nanotechnology, political things like that. It's interesting, about 30 years ago, I was being interviewed for a White House fellowship job. And Dr. Bill Phillips asked me why I was so interested in space. They wanted people interested in taking care of the Earth, not going to space. So I used the all eggs in one basket theory. I said, if there's a threat to all of mankind and it takes out the Earth, we're all gone. But if we spread people out in the solar system and the stars, somebody will survive. Quite interesting. This man was a very well-respected scientist and management executive in the White House. He said, I've never heard that argument before. He said, you've convinced me, and I will support manned space travel from now on. So the fact that there is a primordial threat actually helped me get that job, and my explanation of it, he enjoyed. And I'll talk more about some of those threats later, but I mentioned comet impacts, asteroid impacts, nuclear war. I didn't mention climate change because it never has wiped us out yet. But the man appreciated the concept of primordial threats for the whole human race, and it changed his mind. And I was quite happy that science fiction played a role in that.
All right. And David, you want to go next?
I'm a physicist. I work in atomic force microscopy. I've written a number of stories, some for analog, some that I've released indie, including a number of novels, some science fiction. I do a lot of fantasy these days. I've been a big proponent of space travel. I'm one of the founders of the Space Cub concept, which is kind of working with somebody now on possibly resurrecting that idea. And that's where I am. That's not much here.
And John.
Okay, well, I'm an author from Dublin in Ireland, and I took a while getting to writing. I didn't start till I was 40. And then it took even longer to get to writing some science fiction. But I started with, I've got a couple of plugs here. Making Man, which is a comedy about a Neanderthal engineer. Cheating Death, which is a comedy about the Black Death, which is famously funny. The Black Death, I mean, not the book necessarily. And Killing Chance, which is a comedy about Genghis Khan. But the reason that I'm probably here and on this panel is because I've just released a science fiction comedy, my first one, called Zoomers, which isn't, as the title might lead you to believe, about people making video calls during a pandemic, but it's about time travel and saving all life in the universe from imminent death and imminent extinction. So So that's me. But they're all, I say, they're all comedies. And if you're looking for kind of the hard science that you're doing, Michael, you won't find it in my books really, because it's all made up because it's comedy. But that's what I've done. That's me anyway.
All right. Well, that's fantastic. Why don't we get started then? All right. So humanity having to survive a threat is, whether coming from the cosmos or terrestrial, is a classic trope. Have you come up with a way to turn that trope on its head? If so, what did you do? And it's open to the panel.
Well, I could start if no one else is ready. In Zoomers, which is out the day of recording of this in paperback in the US, instead of the threat coming from the cosmos to us, I had it that if you like, the cosmos knew about the threat and they were trying to find a solution for it, and they came to Earth looking for the solution rather than bringing the problem to Earth. So they had created a way to time travel to travel in time and space, and but once they got there, they didn't know what they were looking for or how they could fix the problem that life was ending on so many planets all at the same time. So they came to Earth because we were so underdeveloped and we didn't have any perspective on time travel, really, or space travel or anything. And so we could go there with a kind of a fresh set of eyes look. So that was me, I suppose, flipping it on its head a little bit, in that they came to Earth looking for help for the problem that was out there rather than bringing the problem to Earth.
I'm curious, what inspired you to write that story?
Well, my books are largely inspired by Douglas Adams and Terry Pratchett. So, but obviously Douglas Adams didn't write a caveman comedy or anything like that. So, Three Ravens, my publishers, just nagged me often enough and long enough to write a science fiction because they wanted to see what somebody with a similar style to Douglas Adams would do with a science fiction setting. So, so when it came to that, and when it comes to the comedy, I think if you had like the problem coming to Earth, it's not as much fun. It's not as funny as taking some unsuspecting Earthmen off to kind of Arthur Dent style, I suppose, just being whisked away, and suddenly they're seeing all these new things and they don't know what's going on. They're trying to make sense of it, and there's a much wider scope for comedy in that setting than just there's a meteor heading to Earth or whatever. It just gives you so much more to play with from a comedy point of view.
Absolutely. Anybody else wanted to talk about how you turned a trope on its head in any way?
Mine's kind of a little backwards. In my novel Survival Test, it wasn't the Earth that was in danger so much, although there was a big war going on, but the war cut off all support to the space stations and the colony that was just under construction and a small moon base. And suddenly now these people had to get together and figure out how to survive. And that's where they tried to get everything together and figure out what they could do and how they could possibly push things and stretch the supplies and find new ways of making supplies, and when they weren't really ready to go fully self-supporting. So, I
mean, I know a lot of readers and other writers sometimes wonder where some of these stories come from. I mean, in your case, where did that what inspired you to write that particular story?
It just was like the next step. A lot of my stories were done in a continuous fictional universe, and it was just the next step along is, okay, what pulls these people away from, we now have, instead of there's an American colony and a German space station, a Japanese space station, and there's a NASA moon base, and what brings them all together as their own thing rather than being various independent things from Earth.
Right.
And so the best way was to cut them off and have them to survive on their own and work together on their own.
All right. And Arlan, do you have anything you want to cover on how you turn a trope on its head?
Oh yeah, I've got let's see, make sure this thing is lined up. Silicon Blood is one of my novels that's out. It's about using nanotechnology for good to fight drug cartels. The people come up with a nanomechanism that kills cocaine addiction and the production, and also heroin. And the cartels who are making $1 billion a day rather resent that. So they come back and force the people to come up with, like the song, I Want a New Drug. And they force new drugs. And they're worse. They grow them in human bodies. And I came up with that concept a long time ago. I call it farms. The druggies, the junkies are actually growing the drugs within their body, and then they're harvested in a gruesome way. And there's a whole infrastructure that's set up to do that. So it's pretty gruesome. It's pretty bad. The one I wanted to talk about, though, is a couple of weeks ago, you might have noticed, I think it was NASA and some other people came up with a meeting about asteroid impacts. And they came out with the conclusion that we could not protect against asteroids impacts unless we knew about 5 years out that they're coming. And they essentially said there's no way to protect. Well, I had an article in Analog about a year ago, and then Catherine Asaro presented a paper of mine at the Interstellar Workshop in 2018, which, among other things, I propose that when we do go out to the asteroids, not only do we mine them, but we bring a few back and put them outside of gravity well, maybe L5 or lunar orbit or someplace, and keep them and have some propulsion effects equipment stored or maybe already embedded on them. So that if we see an asteroid coming out, we send an asteroid out to impact it or to deflect it. Maybe we bring in an armada of small ones. If we're interested, we're afraid of 100-meter or 500-meter ones, we bring in asteroids of that size, put propulsion systems on them and guidance systems, and then shoot them out there and impact them.
No, yeah, I agree. And when I saw that NASA article, I was like, I don't know what they're thinking, because there are so many options. Now, I understand why they say it has to be at least 5 years out, because any little nudging and stuff like that needs to, we're not going to be able to shove a quintillion ton asteroid or planetoid right away, but even a couple months worth of nudging, if we can send something out there.
I'm not talking about nudge. I want to impact the sucker.
Oh no, right. But I mean, I'm just talking options. There's many options.
I would bring in an armada of various size ones, outfitted with propulsion to achieve different orbits. They might be coming out of the ecliptic, in different ways.
Sure.
And so, the way we pay for all that, you mine some asteroids. You make enough money off mining asteroids that you can pay to move the things in, get the equipment, the maintenance, and all the controls ready for it. At least we have a shot.
Yeah.
And,
it's like
I mentioned that to some Sigma people, and Jeff Landis said they had actually proposed that years ago, but nobody would listen. He told me to go ahead, go for it, push it out there again. And I'd like to make that an official proposal, when Elon and these guys get out there and start bringing back asteroid mining ores and things. Let's bring back a few, put them in L5 where they'll be safe. Don't bring them too close to Earth. And then maybe in 50 years, we'll have a protection system.
Well, I mean, because today the most expensive thing is bringing stuff from Earth to orbit and back down again. So what you're proposing is actually practical in as much as you're not trying to figure out a way to bring it down to Earth or anything like that. It's just nudge it into an orbit around us that we have some level of control over and can play billiards basically with whatever's incoming.
Yeah, I don't like the fact that our leading brains out there come out and say we have no defense against it.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
I'm sure the dinosaurs thought the same thing.
I think you may be overthinking that a bit. I mean, if you're presuming the ability to move asteroids around, so you don't need to play billiards with asteroids. You take your asteroid moving stuff, move it out to the asteroid that's coming here, and move it.
No, right. I mean, that's obviously an option. I mean, I think it becomes one of those things where. There are so many possible scenarios where, depending on how far you are and what you have available, moving a pusher of some kind out toward the thing that's coming is an option. Playing billiards obviously is another option. I mean, even if it's far enough out, you could actually send a laser out to it. A strong enough laser if it that in and of itself, just the ablation of the rock being heated up would be enough to potentially long term cause it to deviate slightly. You're not talking about, I mean, just moving at uh, an arc degree, may be enough to, avoid a collision.
Well, going out there and moving it might be difficult if it's coming in at 25,000 miles an hour out of the ecliptic. So, but if
No,
we have something nearby, we could aim it and intercept it, and we at
right,
least have a chance that way.
right. No, and that's what I'm saying. Depending on when and where and everything else, I think there's a lot of potential options, and we've already proven, Elon's proven that even private companies can get stuff up into orbit and do stuff, at a relatively reasonable cost.
Yes, I have to advertise. I have to advertise my T-shirt here in Boca Chica, Spaceport, Texas.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess, I mean, for me, when I wrote Primordial Threat, my scenario was turning the trope upside down is, I think a lot of the tropes focus on an incoming asteroid or comet or whatnot, which are all things that you hopefully can shove or move away. I pose this situation of the whole, if you had literally, I mean, there's something called a primordial black hole, which is essentially things that were born at the birth of, of the universe. And, without getting too, nerdy about the physics of it, they're smaller than traditional black holes and harder to detect. But, hypothetically, they could be, in the neighborhood and you wouldn't know it until it starts getting, let's say Kuiper Belt area and you start seeing some things shift around. But if that thing's heading towards us, there's absolutely nothing we can do. So it's kind of like, all right, what then? And it's the, all solutions were about moving it and doing something else to it. And I posed this. I actually came up with that particular situation when I was sitting in a place called LIGO, which is like a Caltech facility that was looking for gravitational waves. And later did actually discover it. They were processing the data at the time that it was, I was coming up with the idea. So, all right. So, I mean, I think most of the viewers here would be really familiar. I mean, so some of them may be familiar with what happened over Siberia, but everyone I would hope would be familiar with, the KT event 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs died. Basically, half of the life on Earth, all the species, were extinguished due to a 6-mile wide asteroid that impacted the Earth. So. There's been lots of books and movies about these what if scenarios. I mean, the dinosaur killer was kind of like the archetype of the primordial threat. So, did any of those works or any of those books, movies, or otherwise influence any of the writing that you did? Yeah, open it to whoever.
I suppose in a certain way it did, insofar as I tried to not use any of those the things that had already been done, because then it stops, just from my perspective as a comedic writer, then it stops being comedy and starts just being, trying to copy something or make fun of something that's already been done. Whereas as a comedian, you're looking for fresh material, and especially a science fiction comedian should really be doing something completely original. And so I tried to not make it feel like anything else, which probably doesn't really answer your question, but it's
well, it's what to avoid also.
Yeah.
It may be triggering what you don't want to do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I did a story for Amazing back in the 90s called Day of the Dancing Dinosaur, in which it takes place before the KT event, but it shows that dinosaurs, in my story at least, were mostly peaceful. It was the small mammals at the time that were aggressive. And when people had a time viewer that showed that, it had significant social impacts on the world of today. People realized we are the aggressors, the dinosaurs were peaceful victims. This was before the thing hit. I thought that was a turnaround. I enjoyed that.
I've got a short out, Study in Black and Red, which has a the approach of an asteroid is part of the framing story there. But the focus of the story is quite a bit different. It's rather dark. It involves multiple parallel worlds, timelines, many worlds type stuff, and it's so the asteroid is both averted and not. So
The cat is alive and dead.
You got Schrodinger involved here.
Hey, I'd like to mention another primordial threat represented by the other poster behind here, the War of the Worlds. It seems to be appropriate, particularly this week when UFOs happen to be a respectable subject anymore. Now, I've been interested in them for at least 60 years. When I was 20 years old at White Sands Missile Range, there was a UFO event that most of us missed just by a few minutes. It happened. I wrote about it, and I'm not going to get into it right now. But basically, at that moment, the public information officer at Holloman Air Force Base said this thing was probably a meteorite. Now, police reported it taking off from the ground in Las Cruces, going into the air. Security guards and Air Force people saw it, probably a meteorite. But that moment, at 20 years old, I became officially interested in UFOs, and I joined the MUFON and APRO and all these other ones, and looked at it for a long time. I finally resigned from all of it. Just didn't have time and lost interest. But I've always taken them for real, and they were real. Now the Pentagon, apparently, and the Senate have recognized them as real. This would be a real primordial threat, like the poster says, if they were a threat. Now, they've been around, I think, for hundreds or thousands of years, and they don't seem to pose a threat to us. But if they were, it looks like we couldn't do anything about it, not with our latest weapons, not with our radar, nothing. Can't even touch them. And,
well, I mean, I think that actually brings up an excellent point, because ultimately, I think Kevin Anderson had posted something about, when the first, UFO stuff was hitting the news, and in my response to him was, if it's another country, I think we're hosed. But I don't think it's another country if everything that's being said is true, and if it's extraterrestrial, there's really not much we can do about it. Which kind of leads me to a question. Imagine the powers that be, the Pentagon, the governments of the world, know that there is a primordial threat coming. Now, ultimately, they have the responsibility of figuring out what do they tell us, and you can imagine, if they know that something bad is happening and we're all about to die or maybe die, how much should they be telling us and why?
Two things. First off, there's always a battle cruiser. By the way, the reason people are able to get on with their lives is because they don't know about it. But the thing I was thinking earlier when I was thinking about this panel is that if you had a race that started on the opposite end of the galaxy from us, developed the ability to travel at about 10% of the speed of light, and was slowly spreading across the galaxy. It started 2 million years ago. That's old enough to count as primordial, I think.
Yeah.
It would just be arriving now. It would have 2 million years of technical advancement beyond where we are now.
Right.
It would be like a naval carrier battle group encountering a tribe of Homo erectus.
We aren't even amoeba to these people.
Well, we'd be about a Homo erectus. 2 million years is about that range.
Yeah.
Early Homo erectus.
my analog story a few years ago was called The Alien at the Alamo, in which this alien and a human guy sits down and talks to a reporter and says, I'll answer any questions you want, but nobody's going to believe you anyhow. So ask a guy. The guy said, well, why don't you land at the White House or the United Nations and explain yourself and tell the world about us? Talk to a government. And the guy and the alien says, I've just explained to you that we are to you as you are less than amoebas, as you said, Michael. And we're so much more intelligent. Why would we ever want to speak to a government? I think these things have been around for a long time. I don't think they are a threat. If they had been, we wouldn't be here.
All right.
I've tried to explain to reporters before who've interviewed me when I was doing active UFO stuff. What are they here for? Why are they? I said, have no idea. All I can do as an engineer, I had a 50-year career as an engineer, look at the data, look at the information, collect it, try to draw some conclusions from it. And my conclusions are they look like they are some sort of craft with some sort of propulsion and materialization means that we don't understand. Some of it we do. People have made models of some of it. But beyond that, I'm closer, more than likely closer biologically to the little insects that run around in my house than I would be to somebody born in another solar system. Right. Unless we were seeded, like other stories I've had. You need to read my story, Space Book. It's in somebody's collection somewhere last year. It's called Space Book. Why do we see more aliens? Because they're all involved in their version of Facebook. Nobody's interested. Everybody gets to a certain point and they develop the equivalent of Facebook and Twitter, and they go inside and don't talk to anybody else. But in Facebook, the Earth is finally admitted into it. We pay a modest fee and we get this Facebook, and you can see 100 million other civilizations. And the poor guy who's talking about it, telling the story, was a science fiction writer, and he's just now totally screwed because there's 100 million civilizations. You can tune into 100 million channels and see 50 million more human races. And finally, there's one for the past. There's a time travel one, and there's an alternate universe one. And so he's totally out of business because anything you can imagine, all you have to do is call Facebook on your internet, and everything's out there for you.
But you'd never get anything done, would you? Imagine how much scrolling you'd be doing there. God.
So go ahead.
That would be a threat for all of us.
Yeah. So how much does setting matter in the primordial threat type stories? Like for instance, century or location, because not all threats to humanity necessarily have to be based off of on Earth or even on modern time. It could be future or past. I mean, how does that affect the stories that you write?
I don't think, for me, it doesn't affect it at all. Like I have in the caveman comedy I did, and I know this isn't, in fact, it's as far from science fiction as you could get. But in this one, without giving away a massive spoiler, there is something that's going to impact the small collection of tribes of Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons that are there. And at that stage, it could have wiped out all of humanity as it was then because it was so small. But I won't say what it was. But that's set in a Neanderthal landscape, and
sure,
and so that could be there. And then Zoomers is set in space, and it's there, and it's on all. In fact, actually, it's life on all the planets in Zoomers. So actually, the setting is largely irrelevant because it's so ubiquitous across the universe that it doesn't matter. Now, having said that, that is comedy, so you can kind of get away with a bit more, but. For me, anyway, the setting doesn't matter. You can make, as long as the story works, then that's all that really matters, I think.
So John, I'm curious on your caveman type story. Are the cavemen basically, as you would expect? I mean, their science level is caveman science level. I mean, they're just not aware of many of the things. I mean, they know of what we think a caveman would typically be aware of. So,
yeah,
is that true?
So, sort of, yeah. I mean, the main character, Cobble, is he's like an inventor. He's a caveman inventor, but his tribe don't value his inventions. So his tribe are all very, for want of a better word, stupid, and they just laze about all day. And the food, they might pick a bit of food off the tree, and that's all they do. whereas he's got more get up and go about him. So he wants to invent things and do all this, and he goes off and he meets Cro-Magnons coming the other way, who incidentally all speak with posh English schoolboy voices, but that's because it's a comedy, so that's okay. So they come along, going, "Oh, hello, how's it going?" And so they're more intelligent, but not as advanced as. They don't have Cobble's ideas, but they know what their problems are. Do you know? And then the two of them come together, and that's how.
Because that's an interesting take on the kind of story. Because you can imagine all sorts of comedy with regards to, look, I invented something and it rolls, and you go, who cares about that kind of stuff?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Like they thought fire wouldn't last the summer and all that kind of stuff.
So that internet thing,
yeah, exactly, yeah.
In one of my stories, I pointed out one of the things that came up was that your characters will interpret what they see based on what understanding they have. In my story, God of Thunder, a short, it's included in my collection, The Thunderer. It's pretty clear that it's a science fiction story. It's people in the last days of the Viking Greenland colony encountering aliens. One of the people sees the aliens, and they're demons. Clearly, they're demons. Another one sees it and says, "Oh, these are the old gods come back." And that's what the story revolves around. One of the survivors of that little encounter telling the story later in his life is the framing mechanism. And he's absolutely certain that he saw Jotuns and Etten and Svartalfs, and Thor came down and blew them away. But then he gets after effects from the curse there that was pretty clearly he had pretty severe radiation sickness. So a modern reader should see it and understand what was going on, but unreliable narrator and all that. On the other hand, in Big Blue, everybody's pretty clear on what's going on because they have a much more understanding of the bigger universe and space travel and the possibility of previous civilizations leaving relics behind. And then one guy, just as an offhand comment, it started as just a Lovecraftian horror meets kaiju turned into actual science fiction when one of the characters has kind of got a connection because of the way this thing works, and realized these guys, they have like two fundamental forces that we don't even know about, that they use. And that changed the complexion of the story all over, right there. It made the point that a lot of what was going on was simply physics we don't understand yet.
Right.
And so it's because, but again, it's what your character's point of view is going to color whatever they see in something like that.
Right.
Always in all stories, actually. Another threat that we maybe successfully avoided was what we all have been through the last 15 months. I'm sorry, it's the Wuhan flu.
Yeah.
Like it did originate in a lab on purpose in Wuhan, China. My worry about the next threat is that was just a trial run to see how the West responded, and the next one might be on purpose and much more virulent. Having a granddaughter and great-granddaughter living in Hong Kong, I'm kind of concerned about that right now.
No, I mean, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of studies based off of. I mean, who would have thought, like 18 months ago, you could seriously consider it a primordial threat, a threat to humanity, because who would have thought 18 months ago that you would have seen 90% of the world's population wearing a mask? I mean, it's almost inconceivable, but that's exactly what happened.
Speaking of those threats, there's only been twice in my life that I've really been concerned about at least the safety of this nation, if not the world.
You weren't around for Spanish flu, were you? Surely.
No, not that old.
No, the second time was, February or March of last year when it looked like it was really spreading and there was no stopping it. And my son was a doctor up in Boston at a hospital, and boy, they were having people swarming in every night, dying right away, and that was fearful. The other one was, of course, on 9/11, 2001, when a friend of mine in intelligence services called and said, "Arlan, you might get ready. There's 50 loose nukes in the country." At that moment, I was rather scared. And then, of course, again, a couple hours later, another friend called and said, well, obviously they're not loose because they would have been used in New York if they had been around. So, but twice in my life, I've been actually primordially fearful of the survival of the country, if not the world. And the biological threat, when you have biohackers, crazy kids in the basement hacking new germs, new insects, that might be a bigger threat.
Well, that's the danger, because it is, as is evidence from the last 18 months, it's harder to control, it's harder to detect, it's harder to do something about. So ultimately, it is a very serious concern, and I'm sure will be fodder for many future stories to be told. Which actually does bring me to the next question. What would you guys? I mean, for these stories that wrap around primordial threats, does it typically have to be humanity versus nature, like the comet or the black hole or the whatever, or the disease, or
the disease?
Yeah. Or is it better served? Should it be more than that? I mean.
Well, the word primordial implies from the dawn of time.
Right.
So our our typical enemies today aren't primordial threats. They can be existential threats.
Yes.
But they're not primordial. On the other hand, dread old ones are a whole other ballgame. I've seen the arguments that Lovecraft was actually very hard science fiction. Any starfaring society would be so far ahead of us that we would just be gnats to them. And their understanding would be so that even attempting to understand them would tend to drive people mad. Kind of like if you actually intuitively understood quantum mechanics.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, even things that, I mean, we think of like you said, David, primordial threat, would be something, kind of from the dawn of time. But if you look at even the diseases, they would be, it's all based off of genetic code, which kind of has existed, from the dawn of our humanity, let's say. We've had a genetic code, which, there's nothing that would prevent someone, from having hacked that code, so to speak, to a very deleterious effect, for everyone involved. So, but, I mean, like for instance, I'll use an example from my book, on primordial threat, or even something, Darwin's cipher. I did introduce bad agents, bad elements. In Darwin's cipher, I do genetic. It was odd because I actually ended up adding a COVID-19 statement at the head of my book, because I wrote it and released it before the pandemic, but it has to do with cure for cancer, genetic modification that ended up causing what could have been a worldwide disaster, bad guys were involved in the misuse of that genetic tinkering and how it got applied. So yeah.
I kind of wish Speaker were part of this panel, because he tends to come down kind of hard on the, okay, yes, it's one thing when you have a state actor like China, but the actual nuts and bolts of actually doing genetic modification and making something viable is a lot more difficult than people realize when they talk about basement labs and school kids.
Right, right. These are pharmaceutical companies or government-based research facilities that typically do this kind of stuff. Yeah.
It's there's just a whole sheath of techniques and things you have to have around it to make it work. And so down the road, maybe, but we're not there yet at that being a threat. The individual basement genetic modifier
Right.
type thing.
Yes.
Some of the CRISPR people might have a different idea. There are other types of threats that could be social and sociological. The one novel, since we have to self-promote here, called The Valley of the Shaman, has to do with the nature of reality. And reality might be a lot different than we think it is. And some of the lapses that we all have occasionally into parallel worlds, other dimensions, might be as real as the physical world we're in right now. So that would be a threat if people keep saying, "Are we living in a simulation?" You know, after the Matrix movie and all that stuff. But maybe the simulation is not a simulation, but there's a spectrum of worlds that we inhabit all at the same time, and we move through them without knowing it. Sometimes, this happened last week. I was speaking to a friend. He said, "You know, Arlan, I've lived in this one town here in Kentucky for 25 years. And last week, I'm driving the kids to school, and there's two houses I've never seen before. Where the hell did they come from? Did I just not notice them? But, you know, I've driven this same route all these years for, 12 years of school, and I've never seen those houses before." I said, "Well, Tony, you have to read the book that you published for me. Valley of the Shaman explains how it works."
Larry Niven has a short, All the Myriad Ways, which basically goes into the idea of the multiple timelines, basically all timelines, and takes a rather dark look at it, because anything you might possibly do in some timeline you do.
All the Myriad Ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's, and there's people who are doing utterly crazy things, and this just happens to be the one timeline, because it gets to the end. The main character pulls the gun and basically shoots himself in the head, and he doesn't shoot himself in the head, and it goes on into all the different things he could have done at that particular instant. And because in some timeline, he did them.
Yeah.
So that's, one could actually think, that if there's any physical possibility that you could survive something, then in many worlds, your consciousness would then follow that path. And each individual, from their own personal world, would be immortal. Other people would see them die because they're in timelines where the person doesn't continue. Personally, I think this is the timeline where I am the you got to say, oh no, this is the one we want to avoid. I'm the worst case scenario. There's a comic meme about that going around.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of stories that focus on the multiverse and all the other possibilities. I know Blake Crouch did something, Dark Matter, that really focused on that topic as well. Since some of this actually touches on a lot of science, what kind of research do you guys do for your stories, and what would you suggest for someone without a science background, how to best approach writing something like that?
Well, something like that? Or writing in general?
Or any book that contains science.
Yeah. Well, it may not surprise you to learn I don't have a science background, but my advice, and this isn't for everyone at all, but the way I did it was to do, and again, it helps that I'm writing comedy, so no one's, it's not going to be used in Oxbridge as a reference textbook, So I didn't do any research at all, and certainly for Zoomers, the sci-fi that I did do, I didn't, because I didn't want it. I wanted it to sound like a ridiculous comedy, and the characters in it don't really lend themselves to serious science talk, really, except that there are professors. There's a professor on the planet Arcadia, where the main kind of alien planet, and rather than trying to think of some actual kind of really long scientific names for things, I just made up big long words, which makes it funnier. And so if you're writing a comedy, don't do anything at all. Just make up words and put it all down. And like Douglas Adams didn't. I mean, he knew a lot about science, but he made up half the words that he was using. So from a
But
comedy point of view,
but you still have to keep consistent with whatever you've made up. You still like any fantasy genre per se, even if it's science like, you still have to be consistent.
Yeah, I mean, you can hide a lot more with comedy, I think, because
Yes.
certainly writing the time travel and displacement travel and everything, and in Zoomers, someone does question it and says, well, actually, can't we just go back and just do it again, and so the professor can just say, oh no, it's terribly complicated, you wouldn't understand, no, you can't be doing that, no. And that's it, you just move on, so it's, I suppose it's an easy pass for comedy writers, they can just write whatever they like, but for you guys it's harder.
No, I mean, and if you're reading a comedy, you're not necessarily expecting strong, doctoral dissertations on substrate level phosphorylation or anything like that. Yeah,
exactly. Well, actually, it's probably it's almost the total flip of that, because without giving any spoilers, when they're trying to fix the professor who was extremely scientific, who's trying to fix something, and someone suggests that he just hits it with a big stick, he can't quite get his head around it. He's like, can you do that? I don't know. And he really struggles just with the concept of hitting something with a stick,
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, I would suggest to people who are going to be writing, if they don't have a science background, to be more like Heinlein and not like Hugo Gernsback. Don't explain everything, but put it in the background. Heinlein was excellent at that. I've been reading a lot of old Heinlein over the last couple of years for my collection I bought of his, and he talks about 3D printing and automated intelligence. Automated machinery and artificial intelligence, everything else. It's all in the background. No explanation whatsoever. It's just there. You see the results of it. Just like, think about trying to explain this thing to somebody, 40 years ago.
Oh, sure, yeah.
You're carrying around a computer that's the equivalent of all the world's computational power in your pocket, and there's billions of them around the world. And you try to explain that. You try to explain the chips in it and all the other stuff, and you couldn't do it. But what you can do is say, well, we use all this, and we look at pictures of kids and cats, and porn. And that's it. I think, I can't remember who it was that said it, the science fiction writer, anybody could predict the automobile, but it took a science fiction writer to explain the traffic jam. I think maybe Fred Paul said that, but so I think if you don't have a science background, just talk about the way you expect the future to be. Put yourself in the future, if it is a future story. Look around and see what's going on. You're not going to explain it. I mean, none of us today probably could explain all the details of the machines that we use and the computer system we're using right now and everything else. We don't need to.
No, right. And as an author, you kind of have to put yourself in whatever situation it is you're describing. And even if you're not going to describe the science of it, you need to describe what are the natural ramifications of it, like the traffic jam example. What would happen?
My eyes glaze over, even though I've got a doctorate in engineering from years ago. My eyes glaze over when I start to read a lot of technical details in a story. Now, I like the book, The Martian. My son said, you got to read this book. Well, after 60 pages of reading about goddamn potatoes and how to grow potatoes, I was tired of it. I said, if I don't find another character in this book, I'm going to shut it. Keep on going, and pretty soon it got to other characters. But to me, that 60 pages of potatoes could have been down to 10 pages easy and gone with the story. The movie was much better in that respect, I thought. And my eyes glaze over. I don't want orbits, and I don't want calculations and frequencies and stuff. Just show me what's going on, put me there, let me think about it. But sometimes reality would mess up a story. Now, I like the movie Gravity, Sandra Bullock's movie Gravity. Totally insane physics, but a great story. And I've watched it more than once because it's a story. It's a metaphor. It's not real.
Right.
And so if they had gone with the actual physics on there, the story couldn't have been told. I mean, she'd have never made it to the Chinese station. All these different things, just this wouldn't happen. But
right.
So, like you said, I think the needs of the reader come before the needs of the story. Who are you writing for? Are you writing for a technical audience? consider the reader. Always consider the reader. Now, I write for myself, and if a reader likes it, that's fine. If an editor likes it and buys it, that's fine. Otherwise, I do have a drawer full of stories that haven't sold. But
Yep.
I make it up. I don't think I've ever used any technical reference or anything else in anything I've ever written. Of course, half of mine are comedies too. Half of mine are humorous, talks about human frailties and interactions with machines and things like that, based on my own engineering experiences. Some of them are funny and some are tragic.
So some of my funny ones are tragic, so I wouldn't worry about that. I think my take on it would be that and this is just my opinion, is that science fiction shouldn't be a science story. It should be a story with science in it. So the science is the backdrop, but there needs to be a good story. Like if the story is garbage, doesn't matter. Nothing else matters. Then people just switch off, whether it's the science is perfect or flawed or anything. So.
Right. No, if you wanted to read something for science, you go pick up some science journal or something. It's not for a novel necessarily. Yeah. So we're getting close to the end. So when we're writing these things, obviously it's a serious topic. Primordial threats. Threat to humanity. People could die. People do die, maybe. So do you need a happy ending, or can it be mixed with tragedy? And why would you choose whatever your answer would be?
I think the whether an ending is happy, or I've got to be careful how I word things here. If whether an ending is happy or not depends on a whole host of different perspectives. So I definitely don't want to give a spoiler away for the book that's just released today. But but at the end of Zuma's, the ending could potentially make you think, oh, that's a bit disappointing for him, or they might think, oh, fair play, yeah, he's done. So I think it depends how you've been taken along the journey with the book as to whether you think the ending is a happy ending, or whether it's the right ending or the wrong ending, whether it's happy or not. So I think it's a perspective of the reader and the perspective of the characters, and there are a whole heap of variables in there as to whether it's a happy ending or not. But I don't know. Do you mean if it's like, does the Earth explode or does the Earth not explode? Is it that kind of?
Well, it could be. I mean, I guess it really depends on did you kill a darling or enough darlings in your story? Are people expecting it? Is there because I have been criticized that in the past where maybe there was not enough blood.
It's funny you say that, because it's another shameless plug, sorry, but the cheating death. So there's a splattering of main characters in this, really, and obviously it's set during the Black Death where millions of people were killed, and I was a good way into the book and none of the characters had died, and I thought, they can't not die. They're in the middle of the Black Death, like it's just not that I was going to say people wouldn't believe it. When you read it, it's not serious anyway. But so I had to then rethink it, and they didn't all survive anyway. We'll put it that way. But so it depends. Like if you're like, something like cheating death, you think, well, they have to die, so that's fine, and kill them off, great. But then something like a caveman comedy, you think, well, we don't really need to kill anyone in that one, just enjoy the story and stop looking for blood.
One of the things I enjoyed about starting reading science fiction, and when I was about 10 years old, 1950, was that sometimes there were unhappy endings and sometimes there were really bad endings, but people always tried. I think my stories that I enjoy, people at least try. They might, like in wars, you might lose, at least you tried. You went out fighting or something. You didn't whine about it, and that's seems to be characteristic of a lot of stories I've tried to read over the last 20 years, and I can't even read them anymore. This one here again, Silicon Blood. Only 700 million people die in the story. The tragedy gets down to half a dozen people that you know about. At the end of it, there's something upbeat and there's something horribly downbeat about it, and I left it ambiguous. You don't know what is going to happen next. It could be worse than happened before. It could be better. But at least somebody tried. Somebody prevailed. Some people lost horribly.
If you're gonna have a death, you want it a valiant death if possible.
The struggle is the important thing, not the outcome.
I like stories that go dark. Hey, hello, this is me talking. I like stories that go dark. But what I don't like is nihilism. In art, there's a term called chiaroscuro, where you have a largely dark canvas, dark colors and black, but just spot of light in there, illuminating a scene.
Right.
When you mix the light and dark, that's where you can make exciting things happen. And most of my stories generally end on a more upbeat reading. I think that's to a large extent that's what readers prefer. A leavening of downer endings is okay, but for the most part, day in and day out, the more upbeat is going to draw more people.
Right.
I prefer more upbeat in the end. You can go through a lot of darkness to get there.
Yeah.
But if it's done right, that darkness just makes the ending all the sweeter.
And I think outside of comedy, pure comedy, where you don't necessarily expect that much darkness, I think in most novels, most people appreciate or somewhat expect. Actually, I think it improves the story if you have some, kill the darlings, somewhere in the beginning or in the middle or wherever, because then you don't know what's going to happen. Okay, this guy just killed my favorite guy, character. Is my other favorite character going to make it? I don't know. And if no one dies, then, is there a lot of tension in the story?
It's funny you should say that, because before all of my books, before I started writing them, I've always thought, I'm gonna set up a character that people are gonna love, and then I'm gonna kill him like a quarter of the way into the book, and they won't expect it, and then I'll carry on with some other character that I've been slowly building up, and of course I've never done it, because you write it and then you think, oh no, I'm not killing him off, I can't do that, So I think that's probably why you don't see it that often, is that probably the writer himself or herself is just can't bring themselves to do it.
Yeah.
I've got a trilogy coming out, ebook trilogy coming out from Baen sometime, hopefully this year. And one of my primary characters to start with was murdered during the first book. And it shocked me. I didn't see the scene coming. And I almost shed tears. Wait a minute, this happened. It's almost like I'm reporting it, I don't make it up. I kind of see a vision and I try to describe what I'm seeing. And one of the main guys got killed, and I was shocked. Wait a minute! I just had to stop writing that day. That's a good God. How did this come about? And I can't undo it because it's done.
Yep. No, and that I think readers appreciate, because if the author didn't expect it, the reader's probably not going to expect it either.
Yeah.
So, all right. So we're at time. So are there any last things anyone wants to share, talk about? Websites. How do people get in touch with you?
TheWriterInBlack.com.
John?
I'm on Twitter at John Drake Writer. You can find me on the Three Ravens Publishing website, and go to Amazon, because, as I say, the day of recording of this, Zoomers is out, my first science fiction comedy. If you like Douglas Adams, you'll love it.
Excellent. And Arlan?
My stuff's on Amazon. Sigmaforum.org is the organization I belong to. I don't have a private website, but I'm on Facebook as Arlan Andrews.
All right. And, michaelarothman.com, and I'm on Facebook, Twitter, all the normal social media. So I'd like to thank the panelists for a lively discussion, as well as LibertyCon 33 audience for watching. That's it for the Primordial Threats panel. Thanks again, and I think we're signing off.
That's what we're doing.